Welcome everybody to the 8th and final APARC South Asia event for this academic year. This event is part of APARC's series on views from Asia, which was originally designed as a series of webinars looking across the region, across Asia, and how local countries are receiving the new Biden administration. I wanted to actually take the opportunity to go a little bit deeper than looking just at the Biden administration, although we will do that as well. And I want to look at the US-India partnership as a whole. The foreign policy elite in Washington thinks a lot more about India today than it previously did. But I'm not sure it really understands how India approaches the relationship. What does, as we've called this event, India want from a partnership? Understanding that, I think, is fundamental to building a mutually beneficial and therefore robust relationship. So today we're going to educate ourselves on India's approach. We will look closely at this concept of strategic autonomy. We'll look and what that means in today's environment of strategic competition. We will look at how partnership with America can build India's capabilities and India's deterrence in the context of that competition. And we'll put some of our current events into that context, everything from Ladakh to the tension in the relationship in recent weeks. And we could not have a better guide on these topics than Ambassador Professor Shivshankar Menon. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress and a visiting professor at Ashoka. But it's his career in Indian diplomacy and national security that is peerless. He was India's ambassador or high commissioner to Israel, and then Sri Lanka, and then China, and then Pakistan, before becoming foreign secretary and then national security advisor. He is now, in addition to that background, also an educator and an analyst. He's written a couple of books, including most recently, India and Asian Geopolitics. Forgive me, in Australia, I don't have a hard copy, so I can't hold it up. I've only read it on Kindle. But this is a very good and useful book, which does what many great books do, which is to make sense of current events in the context of enduring structural, historical, geographic factors. So Ambassador Menon, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We'll start, Ambassador, at the broadest level. In your book, India and Asian Geopolitics, you say that the goal of Indian grand strategy, rightly, is to transform India into a strong, prosperous, modern country. If that's the goal, what role does partnership with the United States play in that?
Well, the US is a very important partner in that transformation of India. I would say a critical partner, an essential partner, for several reasons. Not only because of the US's international role and stature, she's the only global superpower today in the world, but also because there is a natural fit between India and the US, and the congruence between India and the US has actually been growing over the years. And we've seen this in the transformation of India-US relations since in the last 30 years. But this goes way back. I mean, here are two countries which geographically very differently located at completely different levels of development. And yet we've drawn, and India certainly has drawn on the US all the way back to the Constitution, where if you look at the Indian Constitution, there's a whole set of features which basically drew from the US experience and the US interpretation of our own Constitution. But much more than that, the US, India worked together on the Green Revolution, made it possible for India to feed herself in the late 60s. So quite apart from the political and strategic congruence, which is a relatively recent development in historical terms, there has always been a natural fit between, always been economic complementarity. there's also always been, uh, uh, how do I say this, an attempt to understand each other in the softer aspects of life, in ideology and values and norms and principles. Uh, and I think we tend to ignore that because we look at the day-to-day headlines and the political relationships. But if you look at what India and the US did together in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various human rights covenants, and the application of universal norms, in actually getting the multilateral system to stand up and work, in decolonization. So this goes way back. And there is a fundamental level of congruence there, which I think is often ignored. We get caught up in the daily headlines. And so for me, today, again, today that core, that base of the relationship, which is solid and which actually gives me hope, no matter how, the daily sort of slings and arrows of fortune. That's not quite apart from that. I think this relationship today and in the future is really on a solid basis. And I think that's what people mean when they say this is more than just an alliance of convenience, that it's based on common principles, values. I think it often sounds very airy-fairy, but it's not. And for me, the experience of the last 70 years of the Republic of India proves that. By the way, the US has always been very popular in India. If you look at Gallup, I think, has been measuring this since about 1956. And the US is always in the top 3 of the most popular country, of the country that Indians most admire. Either number 1, number 2, the lowest it's ever fallen, and this is in 1971, was down to number 3.
And no doubt that's only reinforced more and more in recent years as there is people-to-people movement across the 2 countries. And I think that's actually a really important perspective that you've added to this, because we often think of the current period of warmth and deepening partnership as a relatively recent phenomenon, and we hold it in contrast to the sort of darker days of the 70s and 80s when there was a period of tension. But in fact, if you zoom out even further, as you said, it may be that period was the aberration, and that the more normal situation is a situation of warmth. So let's bring it back to today. And when we discuss the sort of, as you would put it in the book, the geopolitics of the relationship, and if you'll indulge the sort of academic jargon, if we talk about internal balancing versus external balancing, there is a concept that perhaps the partnership is useful to India or viewed favorably in India because the US, as you alluded to, is a source of potential strength for India. It's how India can get stronger and more prosperous. But on the other hand, in international relations, we also have a concept of external balancing, that the 2 countries could join together to take on external, that India could join with an external partner, such as the US, to take on foreign policy objectives. So the question I have is, looking at this partnership now, do you see it more as, on the Indian side, being driven by internal balancing or external balancing impulses? And if I was to put an even finer point on it, how likely is it that India would ever see this as an external balancing partnership? That is, would India make commitments that go beyond its direct national interests?
It seems to me it's both. It's both. From an Indian point of view, the relationship with the US is important both for internal balancing, for strengthening India, for transforming India, but also for external balancing. Because if you ask the government of India today, or even ordinary Indians, is the US presence in the Indian Ocean in India's interest? They would say yes. Do you think that the US provides global public security, security goods which are of public interest? Most Indians would tell you yes, whether it's on the economic side in terms of open markets and running the international system, payment systems, etc., or even in terms of providing the basis for some form of security, less than before, but certainly So for India, I think both matter. How far will that external balancing go? That depends on how India sees the situation around it. I have a certain view, but that's not necessarily everyone's view. Uh, it seems to me that India, all governments of India, no matter what their political complexion, and no matter how they present themselves as realists or idealists or whatever, they they have basically followed strategic autonomy by in different names. I mean, in a bipolar Cold War world, it was not aligning with either bloc. Therefore, it was non-alignment. The Janta tried to differentiate themselves, Janta government, by saying they were genuine non-alignment, implying that what had happened before wasn't. But why could they say that? Because they were still balancing, they were shifting. We're in a bipolar world. Once the world became unipolar with the end of the Cold War, I mean, there's nobody to align or not align with. So you follow a multi-directional policy, but strategic autonomy in the sense of keeping the decisions on where, when, and how you engage abroad in your own hands. In that limited sense, I think every government has followed that. So how far will we take external balancing? I think we'll take it just short. We could take it just short of entering into mutual defense commitments. We wouldn't sign an Article 5 of NATO, for instance, where you would be automatically committed to taking certain courses of action if something happened to somebody else. That's unlikely. Why? Because frankly, no two countries, it's very hard to think of other countries which have similar interests to India, which are at similar levels of development, which have the same location, history, geography, whatever. And we didn't fight for independence to hand that over to a bloc or an alliance or to whatever other organizations. But short of that, if you look at it, India has actually managed to maintain her strategic autonomy in the limited sense in which I described it, while balancing, while moving, I think relatively successfully so far between these various power formations as the balance of power has shifted drastically in the world. Today, you see, and as a consequence of the rise of China and the deterioration and the crisis actually in India-China relations, you see today, again, another set of balancing measures. You see the revival of the Quad, you see a whole series of actions, both by India and the US together.
So we will get into all of those in much greater detail, but just on this concept of strategic autonomy, can you help us understand what the difference is between strategic autonomy as you've described it and simply the pursuit of national interests? Because it almost sounds like what you're saying is that India should do what is in its interests. What then differentiates strategic autonomy as a concept?
I am saying that India should do what's in its interest, that's true. But what strategic autonomy means that you have then ruled out one set of actions. You don't sign a defense treaty which commits you to defending somebody else. You have ruled out, let's say, the periphery of alliance in the core sense of the word. You've ruled out some things at the periphery. But in fact, what it demands of you is much more active engagement. Because you've ruled out certain things, you therefore have to be much more actively engaged. So strategic autonomy is not, and people make this mistake very often, it's not autarky, it's not neutrality, it's not balance, not at all. In fact, it demands more of you by way of engagement, by way of involvement in the world, by way of understanding what's going on around you, because you then you're on your own. Secondly, it demands much more material. How do I say this? It demands a certain basis of material power, military, economic, which I think we forgot in the late 50s, and we paid the price in 1962. But that is essential. So there has to be a realist basis to strategic autonomy. which I don't think we can afford to forget. It has consequences, and it's not necessarily the easy option. It's not always the easy option or the convenient option. And therefore, it's very different from, say, the course that China chose. Lean to one side, followed, within 20 years of the Korean War, by a virtual alliance with the US. Now, of course, she's striking out on her own.
There's a couple of important distinctions that you've drawn that strategic autonomy or non-alignment, or its predecessor non-alignment, are not some sort of vague ideological stance. It is a very realist stance that requires hard power as well. And just to be perfectly clear, it sounds like what you're saying then, also in contrast to what some people would say, is that strategic autonomy does not demand a certain level of distance from, say, the United States. It does not require India to be sort of pugnaciously autarkic or independent of countries, that in fact it is consistent with, compatible with a deeper, closer partnership with the US, correct?
Partnership is, I think, the key word here. And which is why, for me, the logic of strategic autonomy leads to a policy where, at least a practice of Indian diplomacy in today's world, contested as it is, where there's no established order, whereas I see it, we're between orders. In this kind of contested situation, seems to me the logical thing to do is to do issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. And in most of these things that matter to India, whether it's maritime security, cyber security, you name it, climate change, the US is a natural partner. I mean, India will work with the US. But strategic autonomy doesn't mean that you have to maintain some distance, or you work with whoever you can work with.
And so when people raise objections to things like the foundational defense agreements and suggest that those things are compromising India's sovereignty, you would not agree with that, correct?
Correct. But I would look at the content of the agreement very carefully, because that's something that every government owes itself. You need to know, when you're connecting your communications to somebody else's, you need to know what's going on. But that's just normal precautionary measures. But yes, for me, foundational agreements, the defense agreement we first signed in 2005, all that is logical. What we did on the civil nuclear deal, for me, this is logical. This is a logical response to a changing situation around us. The basis on which this transformation in India-US relations has taken place is not that we understand each other perfectly or agree on everything. We have congruence, but I think it's the conviction in India that the US is an essential partner in what really matters to us, the transformation of India. And in the US, the conviction that the rise of India is in US strategic interest, which since Condoleezza Rice, at least, has been expressed US policy. And I think that's the basis on which this superstructure has been constructed.
Forgive me for sort of dwelling on this, but I just want to get this clear because it is such a slippery concept. When we talk about strategic autonomy today, and let's assume, I haven't heard anyone in Washington seriously advocating for a mutual defense pact with India. No sort of Article 5 is on offer. Right,
it's
exactly.
Not on offer.
So given that fact, what then is left that proponents of strategic autonomy would object to? What is realistically on offer, or a realistic prospect in the partnership that a proponent of strategic autonomy would say, no, that's a line beyond which we shan't go?
As I said, it would be a commitment to mutual defense. It would be something along those lines, which actually ties your hands for the future. But the fact is that all policy decisions are a bet on the future. So to a certain extent, but those are self-imposed choices. And those are choices you make for yourself. You are limiting your own future options. The purpose of policy is to try and increase your options. So it's hard to answer the question theoretically. But I think those who advocate strategic autonomy like me, we'd know an elephant when we saw one, but it's very hard to describe it.
And this is why politicians very astutely stay away from hypotheticals. So, and again, now to clarify something you also just alluded to, for those who are concerned by the prospect of a closer relationship with the US, what actually is the concern? So you've alluded to this issue of a hypothetical possible threat of entanglement or limiting India's options. Is it the issue that is the concern that a closer security partnership with the US would drag India into unwanted issues, crises, or is it an issue that raised its head in the past month that the US is unreliable as a partner, that when India needs assistance, the US won't be there? Or is it something else even entirely, that a partnership with the US may be unduly provocative to China, that it may elicit from China a disproportionately adverse reaction towards India? What is the concern?
Well, just to put it in context, that the opposition to ever closer India-US relations is shrinking and has been shrinking steadily. Its roots may have been ideological, and there are still some people who are ideologically, let's say, leftist, who are opposed to the US ideologically. I mean, don't forget that in the first two parliaments of India, the Communist Party of India was the second largest party. But it's now shrunk. It's now down to a regional party in one state, basically the communists. I mean, and that's a huge shift towards the right in Indian politics, in Indian domestic politics. So the ideological opposition is actually now tiny and very small, but that's still there, and they're expressive. I mean, they have voice in the media and so on. The other argument that you often hear is of US unpredictability, that US policy has changed, but so has Indian policy, and we've also reacted to changing situations as the world has changed. We've changed. And look at what we've done in our relationship with China. Has gone up, down, up, down. I mean, it's a yo-yo almost. Our relationship with the US. There are some steadier relationships like Russia and so on. But and frankly, that argument about unpredictability, I think the US is actually a predictable path. The US will follow her self-interest as she sees it. And as long as you can count on the US to be rational in that sense, that's all I ask. I'm not asking for some long-term conviction. This is, as I said, if we can insist on strategic autonomy, surely the US can as well. The US can make up her own mind in this relationship, and we need to. And as Democrats, at least, this is something we should be able to understand. We should be able to cope with in a relationship. Entanglement, I think, has now been put to rest. I think during the last 30 years, this whole process of working together, I don't think there's real fear of entanglement. What there is there are those in India who feel so overwhelmed by the situation, by the rise of China, for instance, or by the situation that they see around them, and the uncertainty in the international system, which is so high, that they argue for an alliance. But as you said, that alliance is not even on offer. So frankly, I'm not sure that entanglement is a big explanation. Should India do what it does with the US with one eye on China? You know, I don't think we can hand China a veto over what we do in the pursuit of our own interests. And frankly, what we do with the US is much more than China related. Most of what we do is, whether it's maritime security, what we've done in the defense, security, intelligence fields, whether it's working together in international organizations, whether it's what we're trying to do in climate change, this is not China related. This has nothing to do with China. And certainly the whole range of the economic relationship, which is actually part of the transformation of India. And so I don't see why we think, and people tend to do this. They tend, today especially, everyone sees everything as somehow because of China, or will it offend China? I think that's irrelevant. I mean, I think we should first start thinking about ourselves and our own interests. And since they match with those of the US and the US is willing to work with us, we should work with the US. So this China bogey, in fact, it's a bit of a red herring. I think that if I were Chinese, I would encourage it, this kind of thinking, because it actually gives agency to China in your relationship with the US, and I don't see why we should do that.
We've broached the topic of China, so let's continue on this. The headline event for the past this week, in fact, today, by some counts, today marks the anniversary of the Ladakh incursions, or at least the first reporting of it. Given where we are with what's been dominating the headlines in the last 12 months, if we were to zoom out, if we were to take this larger geopolitical view, as you do in your book, do you see the Ladakh crisis as being something of a milestone? I wouldn't say a turning point, because the trajectory, the trend line was pretty clear to begin with. But in historical perspective, 20, 30 years looking back on Ladakh, will analysts see Ladakh as a milestone that helped to consolidate or accelerate the US-India partnership? Some have said that, I think, a little in overwrought language, that India is now joined with the US in this Cold War, but that may be an overstatement. But do you see Ladakh as being significant on this trend?
I see Ladakh as very significant. I see it as a hinge moment in India-China relations, which are now in crisis. Yes, the crisis has been many years in the building, from at least 2012, possibly all the way back to 2008, after the global financial crisis. And I think the signs of stress in the relationship and of increasing stress were quite clear. But I think Ladakh, in a sense, what happened in spring 2020, I think that represented a huge shift, and therefore the relationship is being reset, India-China. Secondly, I think it also represents a marked shift in Chinese behavior, not just on the border, but towards India, and in expressed attitudes and policy towards India. We're still in the middle of the crisis. I don't think we've come to terms with it yet. Its consequences for India-US relations, frankly, the US stepped up with assistance, intelligence, etc. That part of the relationship was, in any case, pretty solid and was getting more solid. And that's been going on now for decades, actually. But I don't think it changes the direction of India-US relations. If anything, it accelerates them. I mean, it's not so much that that we are now doing things with the US which we would not have been willing to do before, or that we're going to do new things no, I think the areas where we do cooperate, let's say on maritime security in the Quad and so on, all that will continue. Might intensify, might be accelerated, but I don't see that as causing a big shift or change in India-US relations. No, not yet. I think what is more interesting is, and this is where I think any Cold War analogies and so on are overall. This is not, China-US is not Soviet Union-US again, for many reasons, apart from their own interdependence and so on, but even in terms of the power balance between the two and the relationship, their relationship with the rest of the world. I mean, the Soviet Union actually had a considerable amount of soft power at its disposal. And at one stage, if you think of it, of the appeal of communism, of the socialist system and so on, China doesn't have that kind of influence. But she has economic influence, which the Soviet Union never had, at least not on this scale. And you're dealing with a very different world, and they're operating in a globalized world, not in a bipolar, divided world, Cold War world. So I think the effects, therefore, of much worse India-China relations will not be the same as what happened between 59 and 62, for instance, with the second Eisenhower and the first and the Kennedy administration. I don't think it's going to play out quite the same way at all because of this very different context in which we're operating today.
Let me go a little bit deeper on this question of US assistance to India during the crisis. If we were to, again, forgive the hypothetical, but if we were to look to the future, there is, I think, a non-zero risk of conflict breaking out between India and China. As you said, this current crisis is not yet over. And so there is still a risk that a conflict could occur. If such a conflict were to occur, and we can assume that it would be a small border war, what types of assistance or partnership do you think New Delhi would be looking for from the US? And again, I say this very cognizant of what's happened in the past month with the vaccine issue, where there was an expectation that the US would do would provide a certain level of assistance, or at least not hinder the assistance that would naturally be forthcoming. So is there a risk that should a conflict occur with China, that there would be unmet expectations on the Indian side if it is looking for a certain type of partnership that the US is not willing to provide?
But it depends on the nature of the conflict and what actually happens. But ultimately, frankly, if there is conflict over the land border, this is something that India will have to handle on itself. There's no question that the US is not going to get involved in another land war in Asia. That's, but it seems to me most unlikely. And in any case, this is something that India would have to handle. The actual military consequences of the conflict itself is something that India would have to handle. But there would be larger asks, I think, politically, at least to hold the ring internationally. There would be other issues like that. But as I said, that would depend on the nature of the problem, of the conflict, of how it arose, where it arose, what exactly the nature of what the Chinese were doing. Because so far it's been the Chinese who have been changing the status quo. And the initiative so far is with the Chinese. But let's see. I mean, as you said, it's a hypothetical and it's very hard to say. But you did raise one point there, which I think is significant. The risk of the biggest risk to India-US relations today, to me, is not interests or whether, we have slow bureaucracies on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. It is too high expectation. It's this, we both exhibit what Luttwak used to call great power autism. We expect the other to behave as we would, or we think we would, but we don't understand where the other one is actually coming from. And frankly, it seems to be in direct proportion to how great you are or how great you think you are. So there is a real problem here of expectations in this relationship and of this huge demand. Anything happens, the US will fix it for us, and vice versa, that the US expects India to automatically do certain things, and so I think there is an issue of expectation management within, and that comes back to what you said right at the beginning. Do we understand each other? Not very well, I'm afraid, because we project. And because of, as I said, great power autism, I think there is this problem. But the fact is that the US does have much broader interests than India does. The US has global interests, she has to balance those, and will come at many of these problems differently from India. But as long as there is congruence ultimately, and we see enough similarity in what we want and how we go about it, which I think exists, and in fact is growing, I don't see a problem.
Let me bring our discussion on this section to a close by bringing together a couple of these threads. When we talk about India in its road to transformation and India as a rising power which has interests at odds with those of China, And when you mention that hard power is an essential requirement for strategic autonomy, do you think the partnership with the US is necessary for India to develop that hard power in the interests of its own strategic autonomy? Do you think India needs the US to add credibility to its own deterrence against China?
I mean, the simple answer is yes, it does need the US. But it doesn't only need the US, it needs others as well. And that's where the strategic autonomy comes in. I mean, I don't think India can do without Russia, for instance. The US might object to India buying S-400s from Russia, but even though there is a provision for a waiver in the CATSA bill itself, act itself. But, the fact is that, and this is a good example of strategic autonomy, where India needs the US, but also needs others. And when it comes to our continental security issues, we cannot avoid working with countries like Iran, like Russia, and the others. So we have congruence, but not identity of interest. And I think we need to accept that, both sides.
So when we talk about others, as you've raised, we also talk about not just others like Russia and Iran, which for various almost ideological reasons in Washington are anathema, at least in the case of Iran. But when we talk about others, we also talk about other like-minded partners in the region. Countries like Japan and Australia and minilateral groupings like the Quad. So if we're talking about these new coalitions or groupings like the Quad, let's expand out this idea of partnership with the US and talk about partnership with these like-mindeds generally. From India's perspective, what is the benefit of a grouping like the Quad as distinct from bilateral or even trilateral relationships with members of the Quad?
I think the Quad gives you a platform to work with others, because I mean, it can't be just the Quad dealing with, say, maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. After all, this is one body of water. But there are other countries involved. I mean, there's Singapore, there's Indonesia, there's Vietnam, there's ASEAN. So it seems to me that the Quad gives you the basis or a platform, which you can then use to involve other countries, depending on the issue. And I'm glad that the Quad has now evolved into also being a provider of global public goods, whether it's, vaccines or whether it's resilient supply chains and so on, because it's really its convening power that is very important, and its ability to work with others. And the more it does that in this sort of Quad plus, but informal, it doesn't have to be a formal structure kind of thing. Depending on the issue, pick your partners and move forward. And for me, that's the real significance of the Quad. In 2007, for instance, we had invited Australia and Singapore to Malabar, to the exercises. And then, of course, it fell by the wayside for various reasons. So I think the logic has been clear for some time, 2007, 2008. The logic of where we are going with this kind of, you said multilateral, plurilateral, there's various words, but with this sort of flexible geometry, which shifts depending on the issue, depends on the circumstances, the timing. I think that's something which, for me, is the right way forward. We're in a confused time, so there's no point trying some rigid architecture or something that maybe theoretically is logically consistent and inherently coherent, but that's not what the world is. The world is messy. You'll find messy solutions to it.
So this actually perfectly raises the question that I've been wrestling with for some time when it comes to the Quad. Exactly as you said, it's flexible, it's amorphous, it doesn't have a charter, it doesn't have a headquarters, it does not have a written mission or parameters. So it's inherently amorphous and flexible. Is there necessarily a cost? It seems to me that the trade-off for that flexibility is a reduction in credibility, arguably, because it is not an Asian NATO and probably never will be. So is there a necessary trade-off between having that flexibility and having credibility as, if we just talk about the security dimension, as a provider of regional security?
You can sign whatever declaration, piece of paper, charter, mandate, whatever statute that you want. But people will implement it if they think it suits their interests at that time. It's only as effective as the reality. And the reality is there. Secondly, the Quad being amorphous and vague and, as you said, inchoate, despite all that, look at the Chinese reaction. And look at the amount of effort that's being devoted to talk down the Quad, to try and affix labels. And because it's inchoate, actually labels like a nation, NATO, and so on don't stick. So in a sense, being shape-shifting is useful. And so for both reasons, one is effectiveness, the other is the actual effect in the real world and the responses that it has evoked. Both suggest to me that this is actually a good way to move forward.
Absolutely. I mean, and so far, if anything, its flexibility has shown that it can surprise people not by dissipating like sea foam, but by actually developing closer and more significant relations. So let's now, in the time we have left, turn to current events, if we may. Let's zoom in a little bit to current events and India's reception of the Biden administration. This past month was a pretty rocky month for India-US relations, at least in the public sphere. As you said, we don't know how communications went behind closed doors. But at least in the public sphere, the announcement of the Freedom of Navigation Patrol, followed closely by the COVID vaccine fracas, did the relationship no favors. Do you think, in much the same way that I asked about Ladakh, do you think, looking back from the future, that these events of April 2021, especially the COVID vaccine issue, will have any lasting damage on the relationship, or will it be a speed bump that so far appears to have been overcome with the effusive provision of aid and very clear and graphic strategic communications that came with the provision of aid? Do you think it's just a speed bump that will be quickly forgotten, or do you think there'll be lasting damage? Because some people have commented that this could be, another 1971 USS Enterprise type event, not in terms of the actual harm to Indian interests, but in terms of capturing the public imagination and in terms of remaining in the memory as a symbol, as a token of US perfidy.
So I don't think this is going to have lasting effect, with one qualification. It depends on where the US finally comes down on the issue of intellectual property rights for COVID medicines and vaccines. If she joins, India, South Africa, as she did in the case of HIV/AIDS medication under the George Bush administration, when we worked together and we got a waiver and we made sure that the medication reached people in Africa and Asia, poor people. If that is done, I think this is going to be a minor blip. I don't think this will matter. I think the phone-ups, maybe it was clumsy, the announcement, whatever. But I think it's a useful reminder to everyone that not all of us agree on all aspects of the law of the sea. And that India's position on the EEZ and on military passage, for instance, the EEZ, is not unique to India, but not shared with everybody. And it's shared actually with the Chinese and others. So, and I think it's important to remind people that these are complex issues. And maybe it will serve that purpose. But I don't think this, I think it's overdrawn to compare it with 71 or an example of US perfidy. What perfidy? The US never promised something and didn't do it, you know. No, I'm much more sanguine about these things.
I think that seems to be already memories seem to have been pretty short.
Well,
The
we have
press and the
some
public
big
imagination.
things. We have some other big things occupying
Exactly.
whatever we have in mind space.
So let's turn finally to the Biden administration. And let's begin in particular with the US approach to China. There is clearly a degree of consistency now across US administrations that sees China as a strategic competitor, that sees China as the United States' number one most significant and most urgent strategic challenge. So there is a degree of continuity. But can I ask you personally, and if you could project into officialdom in New Delhi, what do you and perhaps New Delhi see as being key differences, noteworthy differences of the Biden administration as compared with its predecessor?
I can't speak for Delhi or for officialdom, but I think I would make 2 points about the Biden administration. This administration, this is the president who probably knows India better than any US president since 1947. Even before that, maybe Teddy Roosevelt visited, but that doesn't qualify as knowing India. Secondly, he staffed his administration, whether it's, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, with people who really know India, know the relationship, and who have been intimately associated with the transformation of India-US relations. And this is not just at the top, at the cabinet level, but down as well. So from an Indian point of view, this is actually a good thing, because and so for me, that gives me hope for the bilateral relationship and for the understanding. As for China being the main strategic challenge, well, welcome to the club. I think we've been saying that for some time. I don't think in the past as well, we've had moments, as I said, during the second Eisenhower administration, for instance, where we agreed on the challenge from China, but we didn't agree on what we would do about it. And we had different approaches. And today, I think we actually agree on how to approach the problem as well. And what we see with the Biden administration is that while the essentials of policy might remain, there's a much more nuanced approach in the practice of that policy, whether it's on climate change. I think it's still too early to say where the US administration is going on trade issues, trade and economic issues. I think I still have an open mind. I don't know enough, and I haven't seen enough, and I'm not sure that the administration itself has actually decided where it's going on trade and economic issues, which are going to be a big part of dealing with China and the China challenge. But for the rest of it, I think most people in India would welcome what they see as a much more practical, nuanced practice of policy, while the fundamentals, as you said, remain much more consistent and much more in line with our own thinking on China.
You've raised a couple of points there when you talk about a more nuanced approach. And indeed, when you talk about being consistent with the Indian approach, which has previously, let's say prior to Ladakh, combined a degree of security rivalry with many dimensions of cooperation as well. Now, and we've had a question from the audience about this topic as well. When we look at both the US approach and indeed the Indian approach post Ladakh, where the relationship is under much greater stress, arguably on the precipice. How much scope is there for both India and the US, independently of each other, but also jointly with each other, in cooperating with China, in finding avenues where there is an urgent global need for major economies and major powers to work together. The issue that is always raised is climate change, but be it climate change or something else, is there now scope for that cooperation on issues, on an issue-based basis, or are we now in an environment where that is just politically too difficult, too fraught?
On the bilateral economic side, I don't think either of us can decouple from China. Not the US, not India. So I think that form of cooperation is going to go on. It might change shape. We might, lessen dependencies, etc. But basically, it will go on. We're not going to decouple economically. Will China cooperate in tackling the transnational issues, which now are the new security agenda? Whether it's cybersecurity, climate change, maritime security. These are all transnational issues, global terrorism, and so on. And I actually think non-proliferation is coming back to the front again. But given that, that's China's choice. And that's a proposition that I think we should be testing China on. By going to China and saying, are you ready to do the following things? Can we do this? And I think we now have a US administration with the savvy, the nous, the experience, to be able to do a process like that. And that's why, for me, therefore, the nuance, the experience, the team that's there is important, because it enables you to try to see and to test these propositions in practice. And I think that's something that's actually in all our interest, because it's not in our interest to have this angry, isolated China sitting in the corner, just trying to make the world's life more difficult. And these are not problems that any one or small group of countries can solve. So therefore, I think we're at a moment where maybe this is the time to test them. Try them. We draw one set of conclusions and take one set of actions. If they do, good. Draw them in. They say they are ready, but I think nobody's actually put them to the test. It's part of our domestic politics. It's gotten to the stage where it's got much harder. You don't have infinite space domestically, and domestic politics is not going to cut you too much slack. But for me, the political rule for most administrations, whether new governments in India or the US and so on, is do it quickly, do it in your first year or so. That's when you really have space, political space, to try these things. After that, you're into some local elections, some other problems.
You've mentioned in your book and a couple of times that we are between orders. It's sort of like a Kuhnian notion that the old paradigm has crumbled, but we're yet to see a new paradigm emerge and take root. In that context, we now have a new administration in Washington as well. If we're looking at the perspective of managing these transnational issues, and we're trying to navigate what type of relationship the US will have with China, that India will have with China, to what extent do you think India can trust the United States, a post-Trump United States, to remain committed to preserving, or as you would put it, building and reinvigorating the global order? Because certainly, even if the old order was not in crisis, there are certainly new issues like climate change, like telecommunications, that require, like cyber, that require urgent institution building, order building. Given that, and given not only the contentious relationship between the US and China, how much can India depend on the United States, which has traditionally been the guarantor and order builder, at least since the Second World War, to do that and to maintain stability in Asia?
I would trust the US to follow her self-interest. And it seems to be in the US self-interest to build some kind of order to replace what no longer exists. And because the US also needs the world, just like India does. India is coming maybe from the opposite direction. And most Indians, I don't think, quite realize the extent to which we are dependent on the world or interdependent with the world. But with the US, it's the other way around. There was a pulling back from global commitments and responsibilities. But I do think that the consequences of that have not been good for the US itself. And I assume that the US will be rational, will see her self-interest, and will follow her self-interest. So that makes, for me, as long as I can make that assumption, it makes the US predictable. And frankly, when you look back at the Trump years, not everything that was done was completely random or bad from an Indian point of view. And this is why you see strong elements of continuity in US policy right through this century, the last 21 years. You can see very strong elements of continuity, despite the very different personality of the different presidents that Americans have elected for themselves. So that gives me hope. I mean, that gives me some basis, at least, to think that maybe we can make that assumption of rationality.
That's a very generous interpretation. Even if you can, however, make that assumption of rationality, right? And arguably the last 5 years have taught us that maybe we should relax that assumption. But even if you make that assumption, then the interpretation and the implementation of pursuing American national interests contains within it multiple courses of action. So you could argue that pursuing TPP was definitely in the US national interest, or you could argue that not being a member of TPP was in the US national interest. So within that very broad parameter contains many different policy options, right? And so when you say that, yes, we should trust the US to pursue its national interests, that could mean any number of things, no?
That's why I put a big question mark at the beginning on foreign economic policy. In both India and the US, this is actually now a matter of domestic political contention. And it's being contested, it's being argued about. In fact, across all the major economies, what you've seen in the last 5 years is a sort of turning inwards, turning away from globalization, even though we live in a globalized world and can't do without the products of globalization. But you've seen this dual circulation in China, you see it happen, you saw it with the Trump administration, but actually even before the Trump administration in the US. And in India, we walked out of our CEP, we've been raising tariffs for 4 years and so on. So there has been it, and for me, that's a big question mark, how we define our own self-interest economically and what kind of foreign economic policies we follow. There is this, the world's got messy, the world's got much harder, life has become more difficult. There is a natural tendency to say, I'll go home, shut my doors and windows, and but I don't think we can do that anymore. In a globalized world economy, I don't think we can serve our own interests. Certainly we can't transform India if that's the way we're going, if we're going back to autarky. And I think the same is true with the others. I think they learn that they need to engage. So, but it might take a while. You're quite right. There are multiple policy options, and the definition of self-interest, I think, will be different from what it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago in each of these. I'm not sure where these arguments will end, I mean, where we'll actually land, but they will have to have a policy. Otherwise, frankly, otherwise we're in a much messier situation and a much more difficult situation. But that's why on foreign economic policy, I agree with you entirely. For me, that part is very murky, very foggy right now.
So let's bring it back to something that you and I both feel a bit more comfortable with, which is security crises. And let me test what you've just said and apply it even to that sphere. A week or two ago, the cover of The Economist said that Taiwan was the most dangerous place in the world. Just in the past day or two, in the Australian press, there is reporting that a year ago, the Australian Defence Force was regarding China as being not just a grey zone threat, but something that could turn into a conventional conflict as well. And of course, Taiwan is the scenario that people are talking about. And you have said in your book, and I think also this morning, that India is strongest when it engages with the world and is involved with the world. So bringing those things together, when we talk about multiple policy options that could be interpreted as being self-interested, Taiwan is an issue which has previously been quite ambiguous. There have been arguments on both sides about whether the US should or should not intervene. It seems that discussion, certainly in elite circles and probably even in public circles, has now shifted to suggest that the US more likely than not would intervene. So on those sorts of broad regional issues, which you could also categorize as being part of order maintenance, right, maintaining the strategic status quo, should the US defend Taiwan militarily? Would that be consistent with US national interests? And the follow-up, the obvious follow-up is, what should India's position be on that? I'm not talking about sending troops, but what should India's position in the context of strategic autonomy and a deepening relationship with the US, how should India position itself on such a crisis?
I'm not sure why people are surprised by what's now been published as having been said by an Australian general. We pay our generals to think bad thoughts and prepare for them. That's their job. That doesn't mean that that's going to happen or that they're going to bring it about. These are the parts of our systems which are supposed to do this. He's just doing his job. And then to draw a big political conclusion and appear surprised, I find that quite amazing. The hypocrisy in that, for me, is quite strange. But the other part of it, without changing the ambiguity in the official US position on Taiwan, the US has, in actual fact, over the last few years, made it quite clear, made her commitment to Taiwan much stronger. Various ways, including what Congress did, including allowing visits, etc. But I think that's because any change in the status quo in Taiwan has huge consequences, not just for the Taiwanese. It's not just a question of a renegade Chinese province coming back. Taiwan is a major source of advanced chips in the world. And this has a huge impact. Taiwan, as being part of the first island chain and of being China's way out of the containment that she sees of having the world's greatest armada 12 nautical miles off her coast in her face. These are big consequences. These are big strategic consequences, not just for the economy, but for the world. So my anticipation is that people will do all they can to prevent that from happening, those kinds of changes. And I think the Chinese know this. So the Chinese might raise the temperature in terms of what they say and so on, but they will think very carefully. And I think while the temptation on the Chinese side may have increased considerably, at the same time, I think that's been matched by this increasing US, Japanese, and other countries' commitment. What would India do? India would, I think, also favor a maintenance of the status quo and do what it could, short of, as you said, not militarily involved and not actually intervening militarily. That, I think, is not today. That's not within the realms of possibility. But short of that, I think we do what we could to maintain the status quo as it is. Because for us, it affects one core interest, which is freedom of navigation in the South China Sea in the Indo-Pacific. It would affect this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So it has huge consequences. It's not just, can China take it militarily? How many people will die? What will happen? It's not. It is a much bigger issue than, I think, just the future of Taiwan and the 27 million people on it.
That's exactly right. And I think that's an issue that people are only belatedly starting to understand. We've too often, or for too long, thought of it as just an island with 20-something million people, which is not insignificant in itself. But I think only now people in Australia and the US are starting to understand what the actual knock-on effects would be, what a post-Taiwan future would actually look like. And I think you've made a good point that it's something that is not just an issue for the United States or its treaty allies, but it's an issue for every power in the region, because these effects really are regional and global. So that's a very good point. Ambassador, I think we have reached the end of our time. I want to thank you for spending time with us and sharing your insights. I think the really interesting takeaways for me are that this idea of strategic autonomy, even though it's got roots in the hackneyed phrase of non-alignment, is actually not a sort of ideological stance at all. It's a very self-interested stance that requires an intimate relationship with tangible sources of power. That relatedly, a partnership with the United States is essential for India, and not just that, but for the region. And I really appreciate the perspective that you've brought to this, that the partnership does not always look the same from the two different capitals, and it doesn't always look the same from one year to the next. But if you take a longer historical view, and if you place as much faith as you do in each country's enlightened self-interest, that should suggest a pretty strong and deepening partnership going forward. So thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you out there in Zoom land for your attention. I hope this continues the way it seems to be continuing.